Hello students, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 8, Regional Economic Integration. So this chapter attempts to explain different regional trade agreements throughout the world. Basically, they have been established to reduce or remove tariffs and other trade barriers. The World Trade Organization is responsible for more than 440 regional trade agreements. So reasons to integrate: generally you want to reach more markets and to reduce tariffs to basically on products that you export. So the opening case, a very interesting one. We've kind of talked about this type of issue before, when a government establishes some type of trade barrier or restriction, and it makes some people happy, and then it doesn't. It makes some other people quite upset. So the opening case, the tomato wars between Mexico and the U.S., primarily Florida. I guess the banana war is over, so now we're into the tomato war. So generally a quick rundown of this conflict. Domestic producers in the U.S. wanted a floor price that imports from Mexico would have to follow, so they couldn't undercut the price too much. And then later on, years later, they wanted it scrapped. Generally, in order to file an anti-dumping complaint against Mexico, as they thought that Mexico producers were selling their products into the U.S. at below market rates. So doing that in order to perhaps make it difficult for the U.S. producers. So the domestic producers went to the government, lobbied the government, trying to get them to agree on to get rid of that floor price so that they could file this anti-dumping complaint. However, the U.S. importers of tomatoes wanted the floor price maintained, as they export various supplies, tomato-based supplies, to Mexico. Not tomato paste, but tomato-based supplies to Mexico. And they export seeds as well. There's U.S. companies in Mexico that wanted it maintained as well. Companies that were in the U.S. had moved to Mexico and were doing quite well. U.S. restaurants, as the case states, wanted it maintained, as without it there would be a fear that if supply decreased for whatever reason, then prices would escalate beyond what they would be able to afford. So this is a great example of the complexities of trade barriers, because you have importers and exporters within your nation, both wanting more or less different things. So as I said, this chapter attempts to explain those trade agreements, why we have trade agreements, the pros and cons of them as well. So regional trade integration, what it means: agreements among countries in various geographical regions in order to reduce trade barriers. So there are some theorists, economists, that theorize that the regional trade agreements that we have throughout the world is creating other issues and problems. So generally, integration is seen as a good thing, but as I said, some observers, theorists, worry that it will lead to a world in which regional trade blocs compete against each other. So you have various parts of the world, they have their own little trade bloc, and they are trading freely within that trade bloc, and they are then restricting trade coming in from other parts of the world, other trade blocs. Almost like in the banana case, the European Union having a trade agreement with Jamaica and African countries. The US and some Latino countries could not get into that that country because of that trade block. So in this possible future scenario, free trade will exist within each block, but each block would protect its market from outside competition with high tariffs. So you have, in essence, free trade happening within an area, but then you have various trade barriers preventing trade coming in. So we're going to talk about NAFTA, we're going to talk about Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a few others. So nice little diagram showing the 5 levels of economic integration that we are going to go over briefly. Here are the 5 areas, free trade being a middle area going out to that political union. So let's start off with our discussion of the free trade levels, and this is something that would be noteworthy for exam purposes. So currently there are 150 agreements in place throughout the world with this free trade area. Basically eliminates all barriers to the trade of goods and services among various countries. NAFTA being one, the European Free Trade Association, EFTA being another one, and there's many others, as I said. So that's basically a free trade area, almost the simplest and first that you'd find in any type of region. Second and third levels, we have the customs union. Basically, the customs union is a free trade area, plus it has adopted a common external trade policy. So the Andean community, and we'll talk about the Andean community, the Andean Pact later on in this chapter as well. But the customs union, as I said, is a free trade plus having that common external trade policy. So they're going to have collectively the same trade policy going out. The third level is a common market. So once a common market is a free trade area, it's a customs union. Plus the difference is that they have that free movement of factors of production. So Mercosur, and we'll talk about Mercosur later on as well, that is an example of a common market. The fourth and fifth levels, we got the economic union. Basically has the characteristics of the first 3, plus this one is the common currency, harmonized tax rate, and a common monetary and fiscal policy. Best example of that is the European Union. Even though it's imperfect, since not all members of the European Union have adopted the euro, and there are differences in tax rates across countries, basically this is still a really good example of the economic union. The political union involves the characteristics of the first 4, plus this one has that central political apparatus that basically coordinates the economic, social, foreign policies of member states. United States is an example. European Union heading towards at least having some partial political union. So those are the 5 levels as you go from free trade, no tariffs, no other trade restrictions, going into now you have the same political agenda, economic, social, foreign policy in that highest 5th level. So there are some cases for regional integration, basically stating, this you are stronger as a country when you're banded together with other countries. So the economic case for integration, as it says there, this is something we've covered in chapter 5 when we talked about the theories of international trade. Global with free trade or freer trade, global economy is stronger, production is higher, so consumption is higher. So generally the world over is better because of the free trade. So that's the economic case for integration. The political case for integration, as it states there, you are linking neighboring economies and countries together, making them more dependent on each other. So that creates incentives for cooperation between neighboring states. And generally, some have found, or some have studied, that there is less risk of wars and conflicts because of that interdependency. However, if you've studied the history of World War I, you'll realize that it was agreements between countries that got every country more or less involved in that first war. Even though it wasn't talking about trade integration, it was more partnerships and agreements between the different countries. So we'll let that political case perhaps, there's some merit to it, but there's also those arguing that it does increase the risk of conflicts, maybe at least conflicts between blocks of countries. So impediments to integration. As it says there, despite the strong economic political arguments for integration, it has never been easy to achieve for two main reasons we'll go over. The first is, although economic integration benefits the majority, it does have some costs, generally to minority industries or groups. So certain groups definitely will lose. Moving to that free trade regime involves some painful adjustments. When the Trans-Pacific Partnership was on the verge of being signed before Trump came into power 4 years ago, it was going to be a significant trade agreement between various countries throughout the world, lowering costs because there would be less trade barriers, subsidies, protection. Some groups are going to win. Consumers are going to win, perhaps in some countries, and especially in Canada, we would pay less for dairy products. We would pay less for agricultural products. However, there would be some groups that would be disadvantaged as well. The dairy industry would not be as protected. So they would have to, in order for them to compete, they would have to lower the prices, and of course some would not be able to survive. Auto workers and other agricultural producers as well. Pharmaceuticals were going to be hit. Research and development. The timeline to maintain that protection, patents, copyrights, whatever, was going to be lowered as well. So it was going to, has advantages in terms of some people, more people perhaps are going to be benefit from it, but there is some cost to it as well. So the second impediment is concerns over national sovereignty. So generally this is the belief that there are certain industries that you may deem to be of national importance, so you want to protect those industries. You want to maintain your national sovereignty, your national decision-making freedom. And it cites there in NAFTA, Mexico's oil industry was excluded because Mexico feared that they would lose control of their oil interests if that was included in that the NAFTA agreement at that time. So we'll continue on with the next slides in our next video section.